Susan Seward. I am the chairman of the Sussex County Board of Supervisors. And we've got some real smart cookies here this morning to guide us through the solar discussion. I'm going to give you some brief information on our two panelists. The first one is Darren Coffey. Darren earned his bachelor's degree in economics and geography from James Madison University. He has a master's in geography from Rutgers University. And he has served as an adjunct professor at James Madison University as well. He has service in the public sector. He has experience in park planning in Charlotte, North Carolina. He was a town planner and community development manager in Blacksburg, Virginia, and a planning director in the counties of Louisa and Fluvanna. His experience includes many facets of local government, from administration, land use planning, economic development, grant administration, transportation, parks and rec, among others. This experience led to the development of the Berkley Group, a local government consulting firm specializing in a wide variety of local government services, including land use planning. Our second panelist is a gentleman named Tyson. He is Vice President of Development for Apex Clean Energy. In this capacity, he is responsible for the origination and development of wind and solar projects within the energy interchanges. Prior to joining Apex, Tyson contributed to the development and construction of over 1,000 megawatts of projects across the U.S. while working with Horizon Wind Energy in Houston, Texas, and subsequently EDP Renewables in Portland, Oregon. He holds an MBA from James Madison University and a BS from JMU's College of Integrated Science and Technology, where he studied renewable energy policy and applications abroad in Malta and Germany. And I said, how does one get a gig in Malta? I really like that. And he has also worked at DOE's National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado. He currently serves as chairman of the Virginia Renewable Energy Alliance, and he is on the board of the Mid-Atlantic Renewable Energy Coalition. So as you can see, we've got some great experience up here with renewable energy. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, but one quick public service announcement. When the panel is over, if folks would grab a survey off the back, and please leave that for the VACO staff when we're done. So thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it over to Darren and Tyson.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's kind of like a flashback of 25 years of my life. I'm Darren Coffey with Berkley Group, here to talk to you all about utility scale solar. By the number of folks in the room, you can tell it's a pretty hot topic around the Commonwealth, as well as other parts of the country. I'll start off by saying that, just like anybody else, I'm all for green energy. Love it, think it's a great idea. But at the end of the day, utility scale solar is land use. And so, as a land use planner, I look at the implications, the potential adverse impacts of the land use. And with solar, if it's not utility scale, there are very few adverse impacts. If you're putting it on your house or you're putting it on your farm, by right, meet the setbacks, go for it. If you're in a historic district, maybe there's some nuances there. With utility scale solar, you're talking about hundreds of acres, and these days, closer to 1,000 acres, maybe thousands of acres. Spotsylvania County is entertaining an application right now for the largest we've seen so far, 6,000 acres of land, making about 4,500 acres of proposed solar panel. So with any land use, the larger the scale, the more adverse impact potentially you're going to have. And so really, with utility scale solar, what I look at, what the main issues are, what differentiates it from a hair salon or a car shop, is the scale of it and the duration of it. This is going to be here for 20, 30, 40 years. You're tying up land use for a generation or more. And so that's hard for planners, it's hard for anybody to wrap their mind around. It's not going to be us who's decommissioning it. It's going to be our children or our grandchildren. So how do we address the land use as land use? And where is it good, where maybe isn't it as good? There are revenue implications with these solar facilities. They do bring money into localities. because of the tax credit, they do not bring nearly as much money into localities as they could. I'm not going to get into that too much, although we can during the Q&A. It's not a land use issue, so I'm not going to get too much on the soapbox. But the county administrators and the board members that I've worked with say, you know, this land use would be a whole lot more palatable for us to consider if we were getting 100% of that revenue. But since we're getting 20% of it, what's it taking the place of? Is it taking the place of future residential development around towns, which is their economic engine? Is it taking away industrial land, which could have jobs and a whole lot more revenue coming in? But where is it being located? And so that's really part of the crux of it is location, 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 right? It's just like any other land use, any other real estate use. Where is it being located? If you can't see it, then it may not be that big of a deal, right? If it's located, you know, if you've got a 500-acre site, panels located on 1,200 acres, and it's buffered, and it's not near any scenic, historic, recreational resources, maybe it's okay, right? If it's on pasture land, if it's on former agricultural land, maybe it's okay. If 500 acres was forested and it's been timbered in anticipation of this use, that's going to be restored back to forest, all right? But you've got 30, 40 years of solar panel, and you've got, what kind of forest was it? You know, anywhere from 20 to 40 years to reforest. So it's just the magnitude of the duration and the magnitude of the scale of the issues that we're talking about, primarily trying to mitigate. So buffers, screening, setbacks, those are things that we look at very carefully. Erosion and sediment control, stormwater, local staffs, even DEQ staff, I would submit, are not used to looking at plans that are this big and this detailed with regard to stormwater and erosion and sediment control. And so one of the things that we always recommend is that you hire a third-party engineer to review the plans before they get submitted to the review party, who could be the Stormwater Conservation District, could be the local staff, could be DEQ. But have an engineering firm who's used to dealing with larger scale projects, maybe even solar projects, have them review those plans. There are nightmare stories around the Commonwealth of stormwater and erosion sediment that wasn't properly designed, wasn't properly enforced. And then there are facilities that have done it right and there have been no issues. When you're talking about very large facilities, there's no issues because it was designed correctly and it was enforced and inspected correctly, which is another issue. Who's inspecting these things? Is it county staff? Is it a third-party inspector? You know, what does that have in terms of an impact, in terms of the cost to the county? Before we get into the special use permit aspects, and that's what it is, depending on what your locality calls it, it's either a special use permit, conditional use permit, or special exception permit. Your state code is the same thing. It's not by right, and it requires action by the Planning Commission and action by the Board of Supervisors. Or if it would happen to be in a town or a city, the council. Before you get to the special use permit, though, and lining out all of the conditions that I've made reference to with regard to setbacks, buffers, screening, erosion, sediment control, etc., construction plan, traffic, that sort of thing. There's a thing in Virginia called the 2232 review. And for those of you who don't know it, real quick, 15.2-2232 of state code basically says if you're a public facility, it needs to be in substantial accord with the comprehensive plan. And so that's one of the things that localities have gotten caught off guard with. They didn't know what they didn't know. They hadn't applied this section to utility scale solar. And so they would traipse along with their special use permit, and then the attorneys would go, oh, time out. Did you do the 2232 review? Didn't know we had to do a 2232 review. So the 2232 is basically a review by the Planning Commission for substantial accord with their comprehensive plan. It doesn't require a public hearing. It just requires a review by the Planning Commission. You can conduct it as a public hearing. It doesn't require going to the governing body, but it can be appealed to the governing body. So you have to do the 2232 review as a first step. So if your comprehensive plan didn't envision solar, which most of us didn't, 5 years ago or more, and it's silent on the issue, then what does that mean? Does that mean no solar? Some communities have said, yes, we're not having solar, it's not in accord with our comp plan, go to the next county. Others have said, well, it's silent on it, we didn't envision it, but it meets some of the same goals and parameters that are generally discussed in the comp plan, so we think it's okay, we think it's in accord with it. If it's a no, it's not substantially in accord, that's the end of the conversation, although it probably will get appealed to the governing body. If the governing body upholds that, then that's the end of the conversation. If it is found to be substantially in accord, then it can move to the use permit process. And then that's where you get into where is it located, how is it buffered, how is it screened, how does it impact adjacent uses, including neighbors. A whole lot of people upset, a whole lot of people for it, and that weighs in at the end of the day. Hopefully, usually not with the planning commission, but inevitably with the elected body, that's going to matter. And so you get into those nuances, which I'm hoping we can get into more as part of the Q&A. I'm going to, I think, leave it at that. Let me see what, I have strict instructions on what I'm supposed to talk about. Yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. I will say that I've worked with a couple counties directly on this, Mecklenburg and Greensville being two of them. Mecklenburg's didn't address it, and they said, we want to remedy that. And so we worked with them to come up with a series of what I think are fairly robust but fair guidelines in their comp plan. And then they amended their Article 20, which was their section of the zoning ordinance that regulated solar facilities. It was really mirrored on the original state model, which I think was probably geared more towards smaller scale. So it was not adequate to sufficiently address or mitigate the adverse impacts of these facilities. But now they have a very robust zoning ordinance, and it says, here's what thou shalt do in submitting an application, and here are the things we want our appointed and elected officials looking for. But that really does, in my mind, is that sets the game rules. I'm kind of like the ref. And these are the rules of the game, just like you have in soccer, like you have in football, etc. And these are the rules by which you play by. And I think the industry, we'll hear from them in a second, appreciates that. They just want to know what are the rules, and don't change them on midstream. We want to do right by you. We want to know what you're looking for. What are the rules? The importance of establishing those rules are every jurisdiction is different. They're going to have different expectations, different desires in terms of setback, etc. The industry is going to have a different point of view. And so you don't want to be negotiating that too much, in my opinion, for every use permit that comes along. You want to have a set of rules that you've established that fit your jurisdiction. And you can't really be cookie cutter about it. There's no magic bullet. Some jurisdictions say 100-foot setback with 50-foot screening is sufficient. Others say 200 feet with 100 feet screening. There's no whatever. What I say is just make sure that it's effective from your point of view, and then you go from there. So Greensville County was different from Mecklenburg in that 2 years ago they amended their comprehensive plan to address solar facilities. They did it, I think, at the request of the solar industry. It's very encouraging for solar. And then they started getting solar applications in, and they went, oh, wait, what? Maybe this is a little too loose. I don't know. Maybe we need to talk about that some more. So they're in the middle of that right now. They've approved 2. We've got a 3rd one in the works now. And so different counties handle it differently. And from a planning perspective, what planners have been doing for the past 2 or 3 years is, Google search and call each other, try to, what did you do with yours? Oh, ours is Dominion. Oh, that's different because this is an independent one. But they're going to sell to Dominion. Oh, that's their. At the end of the day, it's a land use. Best practices are important. It's important for counties to talk to each other. These forums are great. Having the industry at the table is great. There are industry representatives here. There are probably be throwing some questions at us. That's how you get to demystifying this. The cell towers of 15 years ago are the solar, utility scale solar today. When those cell towers started going up, you thought the world was going to end. People hated them, they were opposed to them, not in my backyard, we want our phone to work, so put it somewhere else, don't put it here. And that conversation was had at every use permit, public hearing around the country. Now it's like, no, the tower's going up, okay, cool, good. Coverage is going to improve. So solar is kind of that way. I think if we can figure out what the ground rules are, don't locate it on a historic, Civil War battlefield within the viewshed of one. Don't locate it along a scenic byway. Don't locate it so that lakefront property owners can see it. Screen it, buffer it. It's location, location, location. And then make sure environmentally that it's done correctly, both from a planning and engineering standpoint and enforcement. And I am going to leave it there. I turn it over to Tyson, and then we'll see where this leads. We definitely want to get into some Q&A and back and forth.
Thank you, Darren. And thank you, Susan, also for the introduction. And Chris and Joe, I don't know that I see Joe in the room here, but thank you for the invitation to come and speak today. Like Darren said, we're glad to have the industry at the table to help share some perspective, have this dialogue, which will certainly be an ongoing dialogue, and hopefully answer some questions. So, as Susan mentioned, my name is Tyson Nutt. I'm with Apex Clean Energy, and we're based in Charlottesville, Virginia. And what we do is we develop and we construct, finance, and operate clean energy projects across the country. That involves solar, it also involves wind as well, and increasingly a little bit of storage. And that really points to how we are in a time of accelerating transition in the energy space, looking at these technologies that just a few years ago were not as cost competitive as they are today. So that brings us to this point now where there is increasing interest in having more solar be developed, and how are we going to go about accomplishing that? We're really balancing, I think, the interests of different stakeholder groups that are involved. And there were a number of really good things that Darren was touching on that really stuck with me and that I could just leapfrog onto, which is the fact that it is in many ways about location. And certainly finding the right sites, make sure they have the criteria, that it makes sense when you're really applying the reasonableness test to a project. Is this something that's worthwhile pursuing? And also, I think a point that's a theme is also the case-by-case nature of this. There is not one set of interests that apply to all counties, in the same way there's not one set of interests that apply to all solar developers as well. And so in every case, we need to find what's the right balance for that particular solar development company and that particular county as well. So in my opening remarks, what I thought I might do is share a little bit of our perspective from having gone through the permitting process of an 80 megawatt project in Campbell County, Virginia, not too long ago. It really began for us back in mid-2017 when we acquired the project site from another developer, an earlier stage developer. And at that point really began working first and foremost with the landowner and with some of the neighbors, really understanding what their interests were for the project and what their concerns were as well. Once we did have a land agreement secured with the landowner, we engaged with the county, really starting with staff, planning director, and others to really understand like you mentioned, the zoning within the county and knowing how can we do this in a way that would be compliant with the comprehensive plan, then also looking at the specifics of the zoning that are there. I kind of felt that Campbell County was a bit reflective of the state as a whole, in the sense that we learned there were 2 other solar developers as well. So in one county you had 3 different projects, and they were all very different projects. Ours was the largest. It was on more rural agricultural land. It did have a high voltage transmission line that was coming through that particular farm that we were able to interconnect to. While the others were smaller scale projects, one was in the town limits. The other one was not, but smaller, and just different applications of the technology, really, where you have more remote, rural, fewer stakeholders in proximity to the project. The others smaller, more in town, closer to many more stakeholders. And so I think that brought Campbell County through a perspective of getting to really see both sides of the scale of these potential projects. And so with that, they decided that setting an ordinance in place for the county would be the appropriate step for them. And we went through that process and worked with them as well through that. And there are certainly resources that are helpful in that type of process, right? Darren, the Berkley group and of themselves, other counties will call and network and talk about what are you experiencing, what are we seeing with these technologies. But also the solar industry itself is really trying to make an effort to put out some best practices around what it is that we're doing as an industry to make sure that, as you mentioned, given the scale and the duration of these projects, that they can be done successfully and exist in cooperation with other stakeholders in the area. So you can find more resources, like you mentioned, Googling. Thankfully, we're at a point now where there's enough tangible experience in Virginia that you have some solar developers that are either in the room here, you have industry groups such as Verida, such as NVC, the Solar Research Institute. I'll make sure that Chris, I think he already has this, I bet, but has access to this resource, certainly to make sure that everybody can get a copy of that if they'd like, to really see what are some of those best industry practices that we're learning. So let me touch on just a few other things. We definitely take the perspective of a Virginia-based company, I think first and foremost. Our business depends upon us having a good track record here in the Commonwealth, our ability to really construct, maintain, and operate these projects. We have a remote operations facility in Charlottesville that is FERC and NERC certified. What does that mean? It really means that we're able to maintain and operate military-grade projects. And that's what we're doing. We actually built a solar farm, 15 megawatts in scale, on the Fort Hood military base in Texas, there for the Army, and we're now operating that from our facilities in Charlottesville. And so that really required us to really hit those highest standards in terms of what it takes from an environmental perspective, from a safety and security perspective, to be able to do that. And we are applying those lessons learned across our development for these solar projects. But I do think that also, to bring it back to the point about it being case by case or really about location being one of the key factors, there is absolutely an obligation that solar developers have to do their diligence before selecting the site and beginning to pursue it for development. We have we like to think of as a 62-step process internally at Apex. We need to screen sites to conduct that diligence and to make sure that if we pursue the investments in these projects, that there isn't going to be some unknown fatal flaw or concern that was overlooked and ultimately puts that investment at risk. Equally as it is with the landowners, the neighbors, the county, and others, we also have financing parties that we need to be able to answer to and ensure them that the project can be constructed as permitted and be able to operate for the life of the project. So out of that comes some, I think, really reasonable measures. That again are case by case, but it is reasonable to have a certain amount of setback, a certain amount of screening when appropriate. It is appropriate to look at where can we find the most appropriate ag land for these sites based on highest and best uses. I know there have been some concerns about the property tax benefits. I think that we have found in our cases that there is a net benefit to the county. Certainly, that's something that is a policy that was put in place several years ago, and things do evolve over time. But we are finding that we're able to pursue these projects, and really, if we're doing the right engagement with stakeholders locally, we can incorporate those concerns into the projects and hopefully get them built and continue to set some new precedent. So in the Campbell County case, ultimately we ended up having an ordinance that was approved. We were able to submit the application for that project. We secured unanimous approval for it. Very appreciative of the local support that we had in that instance, and happy to certainly talk through some more lessons learned from there or answer questions that I can. I think I would just also like to say too that I am also on a learning curve as it relates to solar as well, as I know many of you are. We're learning about this technology as it's being implemented across the Commonwealth. So we just want to make sure that we're picking up those lessons learned and applying them to the next projects. And so with that, I really just will be free to try and answer some questions if I can. So thank you.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. I have some
questions here, but I think perhaps go off script a little bit and let's open it up maybe to the audience. And then if they don't capture these questions, we'll circle back and get them.
I love that.
So,
Can everybody hear us okay without the mic, or do we need to pass the mic around?
You need to be on the videotape that they're making.
Need to be on the videotape. That's
So if they got the whole table, that's fine, but I'm counting on you being able to show the people who aren't here this videotape so they get the whole presentation.
You need to be able to hear us on that videotape, or you're gonna have to read lips, and that's not gonna do at all. Right, you wanna?
Sure, so what we're going to do now is, I do have some questions that I think we want the panelists to answer before we all leave here. But if you all don't cover them, we'll circle back to them. So I think at this point, we will open it up for questions from you all. So who wants to be the first and the bravest and start? Wow, okay. Let's see, we'll start over here on this side of the room.
My major concern is what happens to the land when this is no longer there. And I'm very ignorant about this. I've read some reports from North Carolina, I believe it was, and sheep graze under these things, and it's great because the grass is taken care of and the sheep are harvested for food. But my thought is that that's probably not going to happen everywhere, and they don't want to have to cut grass under these panels. And again, I'm just projecting, but if they don't want grass to grow, they're going to kill the grass. So they're going to use at least herbicides, or they're going to sterilize the soil. And they're going to do that over the life of this project, which is 20 to 40 years. And so decommissioning, to me, means putting it back just like it was, so that grass will grow or crops will grow. And am I right or completely wrong in this, that this is a threat that ought to be addressed up front?
Well, I would characterize it as a concern. It's a valid concern to have and to ask those types of questions. Certainly of any developer, of me, I can share with you some of our experience in that area. I think that there's two parts to that. There is what happens with the underlying land during the life of the project, and then there's what happens to that property at the completion of that project's life. On the first side of that, during the operations of the project, I can speak to I can't speak to every solar developer, but in our experience, our intention and our plans and what we've seen that is applicable is to have low-lying grasses that can be planted that would be able to sustain themselves. And then we'll have absolutely maintenance be done to keep access to the property and all that sort of thing. But it does not require stripping of the vegetation or the ability for that soil to sustain a vegetative cover. It's just a matter of having planting that will be conducive with the solar panels, and often that just leads to native or lower growing grasses. There are instances that are very interesting to look at, such as utilizing sheep for grazing. I think that has some scale limitations to it with some of the larger projects, if that's going to be realistic. So it's great to see when those applications do apply. I think they're often going to be on the smaller scale end of projects. But otherwise, that is a part of the overall maintenance of the facility, as having the grasses be maintained and not stripped. And it's also part of, I think, the overall stormwater management and erosion and sediment control requirements for these projects. You need to have that vegetation as a part of those plans to make sure that you're not going to have excessive crops in these instances. Quickly on the second side, which we probably could talk more about as well, but on the decommission. These projects do have a long life cycle. We started out 30 years from 35, and now we're finding that some projects may be able to last for 40 years. Yes, that's a long time, but it also is a limited footprint impact when you talk about the actual disturbance to the underlying ground itself. In our instance, we have a farm that's 3,000 acres owned by one landowner. We have a lease for about 1,200 acres of that. And the facility, including the panels and inverters, would accommodate or use about 700 acres for that. That is a large footprint, but in and of itself, it's about a third, or less than a third, of what that one landowner owns in that one county. What we're able to do through the permitting process is have a third-party independent engineer prepare a decommissioning study for the project, like this specific project, to evaluate what would be the cost to decommission, remove the facilities, and then restore the the land to the state that it was in prior. That doesn't mean that's an overnight transition back to the prior state, but it is an obligation of the permit to have that done. And it's secured through either bond or letter of credit. There's different mechanisms, but it ultimately comes down to the discretion of the county to approve the form of security to ensure that the money is set aside to conduct that decommissioning when the time is right. So this is a great area where I think that we are learning more about that, and there's more standardization that's coming through the industry as to what it takes to decommission a project and to how do you set aside the financial security so that those funds are available when the time comes. So Darren.
So, from my experience, while that is a significant issue, it's not one of the top 3 major ones. You do want the application to say how they're going to maintain the site in terms of vegetation. The industry doesn't want to spend any more money than it has to. You know, they want the lowest maintenance solution possible. So herbicides are not necessarily the lowest cost solution. I would say that if using a herbicide is their number one go-to, then that might be cause for concern. You're going to want to know how often and by whom. You're going to want to maybe have a condition that limits that. But typically what I've seen is that they're going to mow it. At least that's how they started out. And then I think they started figuring out that there was an expensive cost to mowing over 40 years. So if you could have sheep on it, and solar sheep, that was the term I learned recently, solar sheep. I'm assuming they taste like regular sheep, but I think that's a pretty innovative solution, to be able to have grazing and control it that way. In terms of the impact, and you do have to have some sort of land cover to meet stormwater erosion and sediment control measures, but that aspect hasn't been a major issue. The impact to the land after the use has been a bigger concern from a locality standpoint. And then a lot of the applicants will say, we'll remove all the equipment from the site 36 inches down. And we're like, well, what about if it's 42 inches down or 6 feet down? A lot of the counties, they want everything removed. They want everything that's put into the ground taken out of the ground. And there's been some resistance from the industry to do that. They seem to like that 3 foot down rule. If you grow peanuts, I think there's a possible issue with these structures as they weatherize over time. There's some, what is it, cadmium? Zinc. Yeah, it's not toxic or anything, but peanuts don't like it. So if you're in a county with peanuts and they want to put a solar farm on a peanut farm, you might want to think twice about that. But otherwise, pretty potentially low impact. What I look at as a land use planner is what was there before, and what does the comprehensive plan say should be there in the future. The comprehensive plan has designated this area as industrial in the future, and you're putting a solar farm there that's 80% tax credit. Is that the highest and best use? How many jobs are coming out of that post-construction? If it's ag, then perhaps that's more compatible. But was it pasture? Was it soybean field, corn field? Was it forest? If it's forest and it's timber in anticipation of use, and the application says we're going to put it back exactly the way it was before the solar farm got here. Okay, well, again, 40 years plus 40 years is a long, long time to restore a forest. I don't like to see projects that are going to timber and deforest the property in order to do the project. But what I do is just kind of point it out, and it's up to the locality as to whether that's a big deal for them or not. I think some applicants say, we're going to return it to the way it was when we found it. Okay, but we found it timbered. Okay, you found it timbered because the landowner timbered it because they're anticipating misuse. So I think everybody just needs to be upfront about it. What should it look like when it's done? I think if it's done right, if it was an agricultural site, if it was a pasture, it can return to that probably very little use, very little issue. But if you're a town and this site is next to the town and it's supposed to be residential, there's not going to be residential for 40 years. Now maybe that's a good thing. Rooftops cost counties money, rooftops cost cities money. But rooftops are money for a town. If they're in the town, they're direct money for the town. If they're near the town, they're money for the town because where are those residents going to get their services from the town? Solar farm doesn't require many services. They're pretty quiet. They don't have any emissions. They're just kind of there, like a cemetery. They're just kind of there. Okay, they can be a pretty good neighbor. But they're not going to generate dollars for that town. So what are the competing economic interests? And is the proposed use taking up that land? Or is it on land that there's not really another identified use for it? You can't see it. And so it's relatively innocuous.
We had this gentleman here, and then we'll go back there.
Right. Over to the speaker of Apex. There was a comment that you made. You said that there was a net benefit to the solar farm. I mean, we are all, as local members, are asking the question, well, you know, as he just mentioned, you know, there's a huge cut on our real estate tax. We can't tax the equipment, you know, the infrastructure of that. So what is the net benefit?
Well, it's a fair question certainly to ask, and I think that speaking from the particular project experience with our Dragonfly solar project, we had an economic analysis that was done as a part of that permit application with Magnum Economics, and what that showed us was the project, even with the property tax exemption down to 20%, was going to result in a 20-fold increase to the property taxes yielded from that property. So that's really what we're looking at from going, I think on average it was around $4,000 or so per year in annual property taxes. That would increase up to about $50,000 per year property tax average on that particular property. And overall, it was about 1.7 or so $1 million per year. So that's what I was referring to specifically. But again, like using the phrase net benefit is a pretty broad and generic phrase to use, so that can be applied across many spectrums. But I do look at it from a couple different categories, from the economic category, environmental category, and others. But it's a good question, and that's from our experience in running the actual economics on it. That's what we found there too.
Thank you.
And if I could just add to that real quick, you know, if it was a property that was in land use, it's going to come out of land use, and so you have that benefit. There is an improvement to the property. It's not 80% the tax credit to the real estate, it's machinery and tools or personal property, depending on the county and how they classify it. So you're going to have a bump increase in the real estate tax value. It's not huge, but it's there. And then there's the machinery and tools, which you get 20% of. Magnum Economics did another study in another county and concluded, and I think they're very reputable and they do a very good job. They concluded that there'd be $1 million over 20 years, which I think comes out to like $40,000 a year. So there's a net benefit, but how's the county handling the inspections? In Southampton County, I think they hired staff to do the inspections. So it's a huge facility. So if you're hiring a $40,000 a year position, $65,000 a year with bennies, you're getting however many per year, you know, does it net out? Without that 80% tax credit, I think the revenue positive period in the story. The only thing you would be worried about is it competing with industry for jobs. But the agricultural component, I think it would significantly mitigate that in terms of return on revenue, as well as with rooftops. That's just my opinion.
A little bit of my question kind of ties into that, but how is it related to real estate taxes and the value of that transferred over to communities?
So I'm not a tax assessor and I don't play on the TV, but if you're pasture land and you're in ag, you're probably potentially in land use. When you roll out of land use, your real estate tax is just based on a vacant land. If you put equipment on that land, now it's classified as, I think they classify it as commercial. And so your value of the real estate is going to go up by a certain percentage. It's not huge, but it is a positive increase, and that is a real estate tax that you get back to your commercial revenue that goes into the general fund coffers.
Back there and over there.
I'm in Buckingham with the first where you spoke that we're getting the next largest solar farm coming in. And I see them as kind of a net neutral because of the tax situation. The biggest benefit is the lease that the landowner gets for the 40 years. But my question is, can the industry see their way fit, or can the state see their way fit to, as we get more and more of these in, more of these facilities in, they do lessen the potential revenue coming in for that land from other purposes, other industries. Of course, in Buckingham, we don't have a lot of that, but we got a lot of land. We got tens of thousands of acres. And if we could get a little more revenue off of them, in addition to just the initial front-end hit or windfall that we get with the building permit, over the long term, you know, would be better, because 80% tax rate really doesn't give us that much. But like you said, they don't ask for anything. They're a good neighbor. You know, they're quiet, they're peaceful, they don't have any kids to send to school. But they have a very unfair advantage over other industries, because we don't get any machinery and tools off of them, and they've got a substantial amount of investment. And as far as the decommissioning, my perspective on that, I don't know how the rest of y'all feel, but I am probably the biggest land rights advocate in the room here. The decommissioning, it's the landowner's land that makes the agreement with the company. You know, that should be a private arrangement between the two of them. It's not, I don't believe it's our business to butt in and tell them that they have to clean it up in the end, because the landowner can negotiate that in his rent or in his lease that he's going to get, because it's his land, it's not ours. You know, on the decommissioning, and that could be a substantial expense, you know, that the landowner can recoup or gain or make that their windfall. And then the subsequent owner in the chain of title, they just have to know this was there, and they may not be able to use it for their future purpose. But my main question is, can the 80% reduction be scaled down over time to allow the tax, or allow tax revenue to come into the community over these things? That's my question.
No, it's a good question, certainly, and Susan was just reminding me too also how there is a sunset provision with regard to that 8% exemption, and that's in, I think, 2024, when that would ramp down, and if not cease entirely, I think it may go down to just a lower percentage. But I think that also there is two thoughts that come to mind around your comments there on that aspect in particular. There has been a lot of change since even just the time that is a state level policy that was put in place, and really looking at how can Virginia try to attract this industry's investments when we know that we're competing with other neighboring states as well. I mean, I've seen some statistics recently around, I think it's 70% of the Fortune 100 companies that have sustainability goals, and they are being driven by kind of fundamental customer demand in the same way that, you know, the utilities are being driven, elected officials are being driven. I mean, there is certainly a value being placed on clean energy and access to it. Go ahead, do you have an interest?
Part two to that question, you said 2024 is a sunset clause on that?
I believe so.
Now, does that apply to existing facilities or only facilities installed after 2024?
Right, so that actually is the second part of what I wanted to touch on, which is the fact that that's a policy, a state level policy, right? Used again just to have Virginia be competitive to attract these investments with other states. At the same time too, once that policy is in place, it is very difficult to sort out, okay, what should be the future trajectory for it. There is this sunset clause that we mentioned, but projects that are constructed and built and operating certainly would be grandfathered through and have that applied to the economics for that project for its operational life. But what we're finding is that because solar's cost has come down so much, that there is some room in there to work on things like community benefit agreements, project by project case, depending upon the economics, in those projects. But I can give you, for instance, from our experience in the Dragonfly project, we were able to engage with the Virginia Technical Institute to establish, assist them in establishing a sponsorship program for some local training programs for solar installers. You know, that again could be another way of feeding it. We mentioned the jobs. I think it would require the job to help do inspections. Could we also help enable jobs being created locally for the installation and potentially for the maintenance of these projects? And that's not the only case. On the Southside Virginia Community College, they also are working with industry reps like Solar UNESCO, MDBC, SRI, again to try and establish those types of training programs as well. And so I think that beyond just the property tax element, there are other areas to look at. How can these be a contributor to the local community and see that, you know, those benefits are being replicated even before the sunset of that property tax takes place.
And I would just say, you know, that the tax credit was put in place to encourage the industry, and that's great. It's all well intended. I just don't think the industry needs it, and I think localities do. So talk to your General Assembly members and make your feelings known on that. With regard to decommissioning, the beautiful thing about planning is it's a balance of private property rights and public health, safety, and welfare. And I've seen too many projects in my career where the developer didn't finish the road, he didn't finish the stormwater pond, they went bankrupt. Even though they came up under a new name and started building again over here. Who's stuck with that? And when the residents show up to the Board of Supervisors meeting angry and they want it finished, guess who gets stuck with that? You and me, the taxpayer, to finish it. If there isn't a proper security posted. If there is, then that pays for it. And so what is a proper security over 40 years? Is it a letter of credit? Is it an escrow? Is it a bond? Is it, what is it? Money talks, right? But the industry doesn't want to tie up millions of dollars for 40 years. So what's the right balance? And decommissioning is a big deal for appointed elected officials to wrap their head around and try to get right. It is an agreement between the applicant and the property owner, but if things go bad 20 years down the road and there's defunct equipment sitting there, is the property owner really going to clean that up? Are they stuck with it? Or if the county did the right thing, is there money in the bank or somehow to pull that and be able to clean it up per the agreement? So those are some of the issues, and decommissioning is kind of where the rubber meets the road with utility scale. It's a big deal that, again, there's not one size fits all. Different localities have different opinions on it.
And just to supplement that too, because I think you're right, that is a very important topic, and I think that we are at that point now in Virginia where there have been projects that have been permitted with those third-party engineering assessments on what the decommissioning cost will be, but then also just the discretion of the county. I mean, that's where the authority lies for the approval. These are conditional use permits in most instances. And so that's been our experience, is to work directly with the county to ensure that they are comfortable that those finances will be available when the time is right, and that they are trued up over the life of the project. So there's often a need to come in, typically.
Every 5 years is a very common thing.
Yep, and that's what we've experienced as well. And so that way, all parties do have that type of assurance of, okay, there's going to be a true up on this over time, and also the discretion and authority with the counties to make sure that it's in a form that's securitized from their perspective over the life of these projects.
Yes, I want to demonstrate a little bit of ignorance on the financing of these projects. We have two projects in Page County, $100 million worth between the two of them. I'm just wondering, the 30% tax credit on that, how is that parlayed? Is it simply that somebody gets that 30% off the cost of something? Or, and I know it's not dollars in suitcases that people are carrying away, but the landowner, of course, is very, very anxious to see the project, and so is the developer. Who receives the benefit of the 30% tax credit on $100 million, and do they take it away when they sell the project to somebody else, or to the power company?
Right. No, they don't, and the reason why I say that is because it's dependent upon the owner of the facility is who is able to take advantage of that. Now, I first want to frame it in the sense that, in the same way that the property tax exemption is a state policy to drive the investment, the investment tax credit is a federal policy meant to drive the investment. And it is tied to the owner of the facility that has the tax appetite to be able to take advantage of that 30% tax credit. So what's the reality? The reality is that there are a lot of companies that are involved in these projects that do not have that amount of tax appetite on a year-over-year basis. You mentioned, say, a $100 million project. That's going to generate, $30 million tax credit, something on that level. We're talking general terms. Then that's where the investment comes in. And so all these projects, they really do look at how can we make sure that when we mention a 35, 40-year operational life, that these things will deliver what they are said to deliver, because they are often backstopped through this financing process for tax investors, right? It's called tax equity in that instance.
So that equity is carried to some other indebtedness of the company? So to other projects that either...
I think the way to frame it in my mind is that it is a tax credit that is tied to the project. And so the investor who is going to benefit from that has to be the owner of the project. The project entity, yes.
We actually, VACO staff has presented a little kind of cheat sheet on what this property tax exemption is. So if I could just digress for a second, I'm going to read this as prepared by VACO staff so everybody can kind of wrap their head around it. The property tax exemptions for utility scale solar, what does it mean? So first of all, there is a 100% exemption from machinery and tools tax for projects that are 20 megawatts or less if your interconnection was filed before December 31st, 2018. 100% machinery and tools exemption for 20 megawatts or less that serve public higher education or private colleges. And 100% exemption from machinery and tools for 5 megawatts or less for which the interconnect request is filed on or after January 1, 2019. The 80% machinery and tool exemptions apply to projects greater than 20 megawatts if the interconnect request was filed before July 1, 2018. 80% machinery and tool exemption if you're greater than 20 megawatts and less than 150 megawatts if your interconnect was filed before July 1, 2018. There is local option for 150 megawatts and above. The exemption for the 20 megawatts to 150 megawatts sunsets January 1st, 2024. Joe, did I get that right?
Yeah, and
Okay.
the critical part about that is it has to begin construction by January 1st, 2024. And we do have that, and I think Chris is here. This is something we can make available on the website as a part of the follow-up for this.
Right, thank you. Yeah, I said, look, I need Solar 101 for dummies. Prepare this for me, please.
Just for clarity, that was not any part of the question that I asked. Just for clarity. I'm talking about the federal tax.
Okay.
Yeah.
But this is what we have for state for just sort of inform the discussion there. So, anyway, turn it back to you guys. Next question here. Okay.
So we're a rural community, small land mass, mountainous, not real good locations for solar. However, we are starting a rather significant reservoir project. Public land, public water supply, 150 acres, looking for ways to help pay off a 30-year bond on the building of the reservoir, and wondering if any land use issues come up that you see on this public land, and whether any technical issues you see as this won't work, and whether it's been tried in Virginia yet, floating solar panels.
Yeah, that's a good one. So if there aren't going to be any boaters or anticipated boaters in this reservoir, then maybe you can cover it with panels and nobody cares.
But we'll be competing.
Not sure how that
with the,
impacts
with the
fishing.
sportsmen.
Put electric eels in the water.
There are absolutely folks that are looking at that, but let me actually come at that from a different angle, which is, this is what's, I think, really unique what's happening right now. One of the other questions that you hear often about solar projects, right, or any other form of renewables, is it's dependent upon the availability of the resource. The sun during the day, that's when you're being powered. But what we're seeing is there's obviously improvements in the battery storage technology that's making that more economical. There are opportunities to pair it with pump storage hydro facilities, effectively making that battery for solar, as well as pairing it with wind resources. Also, we're a company, we do solar and wind, and so for the Army, that's what we did. We paired a 15 megawatt on-base solar facility with a 50 megawatt off-base wind farm. And we are providing 100% of the power with some grid, basically the grid serving as a battery in that instance, for that grid base, one of the largest bases in the country. And so it is a really, I think, compelling case where you look at how solar is the least cost resource according to Dominion's own IRP. And then when you're able to pair that with other clean energy resources, you can begin to get to this closer to more stable 24/7 power supply. And we're seeing this being one of the key attractors for a lot of data centers that are coming to Virginia. Not only is it an internet hub that people mention, 70% of the world's internet traffic comes through Virginia, they say. I have no idea whether that's true or not, but right. But there is a great concentration here of the infrastructure for that, the development around those data centers, the fact that they are 24/7 facilities. They're being built and owned and operated by companies that have sustainability or environmental goals. They're looking for these clean energy investments. And now we have solar and wind that can pair up and provide that to them on a more economic basis. That's what's really helping us move these investment opportunities forward. And pairing it with hydro facilities, absolutely is an option that's being considered and looked at, and frankly being used elsewhere in the country.
Anywhere in Virginia yet?
Well, I think that if you talk to Dominion, I mean, they do have the Bath County pump storage facility, which is one of the largest. You talk to APCO, they have Smith Mountain Lake. Both of those, just given the fact that they are interconnected to the utility grid, and if that grid is being supplied by renewables, it's all interchanged. And so they will want to run a solar farm or a wind farm whenever the resource is the best, because that's a zero fuel cost resource. And they can use that to then pump the water, store it so that they can then release it and generate power at the most optimal time for them. So I think that's absolutely where things are headed in terms of integrating these resources to address the intermittency concerns and make them more stable and cost effective, quite frankly.
I would guess you're probably not going to be looking at a utility scale facility, you're probably looking at something at least less than 20 megawatts. So, but otherwise, it could be a good pilot.
So we have a solar ordinance in our community. We don't have anybody that has made use of it yet. So we haven't really had the opportunity to test to make sure our solar ordinance is good. But if we as a community are trying to attract this type of investment, what are we looking for just very basic level? What size, what shape? Is Rolling Hills sufficient for a solar farm? You know, what are just the very basic land use considerations to start with if we're making efforts to attract it?
Sure. First, I would say that having an ordinance that offers the predictability to a solar developer to understand here are the rules of the road should we engage in this county to permit a project, that in and of itself is very helpful. Beyond that, you get back into the location is everything type of analysis. What is it about a particular site? There's so much geographic diversity across Virginia, it's hard to say, not mentioning which county it is or knowing.
Not Gathering County.
Okay, all right, well, but the variations in topography, variations in proximity to electrical transmission lines, the types of habitat that are there, all of these things that need to be assessed before figuring out whether or not a project is viable is something that developers need to be doing on the front end. Like I mentioned, we have our diligence process that we go through that assesses how close can we be to a transmission line? Is there capacity on that particular line, right? How much does it cost for power to be delivered from that point to where it's going to be consumed? To the actual lay of land, is it open grazing cattle land versus other habitat? Is it commercial timberland that is about to be timbered? There are instances where it can make sense as a rolling land use. So not necessarily speaking to the specifics of those site elements, I can just say that having a reasonable ordinance that is periodically updated and kept up to date with where the best practices are headed certainly gives, I think, a lot of certainty to the industry.
So industry folks, take note. Montgomery County just raised their hand.
Right there, sir.
This Apex question, how stringent has DEQ been on stormwater management? Because it's really drastically changing the off-fall that will be felt downstream for miles.
That's a good question also, and one that I personally can't speak to from an experience perspective. I've not had a project that's been constructed that has had the stormwater permit be managed by DEQ. We're in an instance where when we go to construction, we're in a county that manages, I think it's called the SB&B process, where the county has the option to manage its own stormwater permitting. That happens to be the instance in the county where we're located. But I do think that is an area of some lessons learned that the industry is paying attention to, I know the agencies are paying attention to as well. And it's on the area of inspections and compliance, making sure that DEQ has the resources to be able to do that. I do know that the solar industry is recognizing of the amount of time and resources it takes to permit the number of facilities that are being proposed. And there are discussions to try and figure out how can we make that an option to alleviate some of DEQ's resource constraints. Quite frankly, we're talking about man hours. But
Yeah, follow up on that, VDOT designed secondary roads for a 10-year storm. Well, we have 2 or 3 10-year storms every summer now. And this is the same application if we take acres and make a hard surface. It's the same as a rural area changing to an urban area, and you pave everything, more sidewalks, more parking lots. Certainly, the off-fall stream that has caught that water for centuries is not adequate anymore. Roanoke River is a real good example.
yeah, I think that all that really I come back to is how there are no shortcuts when it comes to stormwater management or erosion and sediment control, planning, and institution for solar projects. They need to comply by the regulations, have them be implemented, have them be inspected, maintained. So there are no shortcuts there, certainly, and it's something that it's important. Yeah, and I think that it's also a characteristic of the projects that can be, frankly, beneficial, given the amount of soil and habitat and undergrowth that can be maintained for the projects.
By law, it's not allowed to have an impact. It's supposed to be controlled so that it's net neutral. But if it's poorly designed, poorly implemented, we know that's not going to be the case. So that's the importance of not skipping that step. Having a third-party engineer look at it, make sure it's adequately designed, or preferably a little bit over-designed, so that it leaves things better than it found it. There is pervious surface underneath these panels. So, if that's vegetated and there are stormwater facilities that water is running to and it's adequately filtering and holding that water, then it's probably not going to be that big of a deal. But if it's not done right, the bigger the project, the bigger the deal is going to be downstream.
This may be out of your wheelhouse, but what's the technological expectations in the next several years of increasing efficiency of solar collectors that might allow for industrial scale on smaller parcels, and maybe even parking lots and rooftops, industrial rooftops.
The way that I would frame this is, it's very impressive to see how the technology, even though as simple as it is, it still evolves. We've moved to more of a preference as an industry for single axis trackers that can be more efficient tracking the sun to increase efficiency. We've seen the net capacity factors, which speak to the efficiency of the panels, increase substantially in the last few years. But probably most importantly is that we've seen the footprints, the required footprint, the required land area to generate the same amount of energy be reduced as well. And this has been an area that's, to me, it's very encouraging. It means that we're able to produce more power with less land, and that's the direction that we're headed in, and it's great. And certainly there are limits to efficiencies, in all laws of physics, I suppose, but the improvements have been great. I think that just leads to the ability to have more applications in more areas, whether it be distributed generation or not. But at the end of the day, there is a economies of scale element to this that makes building a, call it 50 megawatt project in a low disturbance area the most cost-effective approach when it comes to all of us who have a common issue of having low-cost electricity. We mentioned the cell towers, exactly, and now we all have cell phones we need to charge. And so now we're looking at more solar panels to help meet that demand. But thankfully, it is happening increasingly efficiently and with less land on a megawatt basis.
I just have a quick, pretty much just a statement, and thank you to Darren for calling it utility scale solar as opposed to a farm. It's not a farm. Thank you.
I really appreciate the modesty, both of you, in your presentation, because you have consciously attempted not to oversell solar. But on the other hand, I don't think you've been really fully open to providing the audience with an awareness of what you see as the intangible benefits for a county to develop a solar project from the standpoint of moving it into a new energy paradigm and also signaling the business that you're open to being innovative and creative in your land use and looking at ways to be more effective in providing energy into the grid. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
So I'll let the industry expert finish on this one, but I would just say from my perspective, modesty doesn't have anything to do with it. I'm a planner. I look at land use issues. I advise planning commissions to just look at land use issues. Don't worry about the revenue. Don't worry about anything other mitigating the adverse impacts of the land use. Let the elected officials worry about the money. And if there wasn't an 80% tax credit, it would be a whole lot more attractive to those elected officials. But that is not my purview. That is not the planning commission's purview. So I avoid it and don't make that value judgment. Every land use is neutral. They're not inherently good or evil, but they all have an impact. Some more than others, and some that makes some a better idea than others. So it just goes back to, with utility scale solar, where is it being proposed? How big is it? How long? What are they talking about in terms of the plan, decommissioning plan and everything else? The devil's in the details. And it's case by case basis, which is why it's a use permit pretty much everywhere.
Well, I appreciate your comments, certainly, and I think that really from the time that we have here, wanting to make sure we do touch on the land use planning issues, certainly there are, I think, other externalities that are tremendous benefits of this technology. But I think that one thing that's really interesting to me is watching over time the phone calls that we receive, whether it's a local chamber or others who have had industry approach them about installation of whether it be a manufacturing facility, a brewery, a data center, whatever it may be, And they mentioned to us, they really would like to see some solar, near the facility. They'd like to understand how it can be paired with wind. They're looking for access to these technologies. And I think that speaks to some of those elements. Certainly, there are, I think, meaningful stats around some of our projects. Like this Dragonfly project, it's 100,000 tons of CO2 being captured every year. Otherwise, emitted from alternate resources. But I did try to really focus on land use topics today. And, but beyond that, I think that, I hope that I'm the only individual from the industry here today, but there are a lot of people who are trying to help set the right precedents, help set the industry standards, through NDVC, through the Solar Research Institute, and others that we'd love to be able to keep this an ongoing discussion so that we can really make sure that it
Chris, we have one more, or we, okay, one more question, and then we turn to the pumpkins, so.
One question I have is, there was mention of storms. We do get hurricanes, we get tornadoes. What is the environmental impact on your farms is hit by a tornado?